Last summer, my friend Jamie and I decided to take a road trip along the coast, stopping at various small towns along the way. To save money and enhance our adventure, we booked different Airbnbs. Our favorite was supposed to be this old Victorian house converted into a guest home in a quaint seaside town. The host, an elderly woman named Mrs. Whitmore, seemed sweet in our messages, full of local tips and historical anecdotes. We arrived late in the afternoon. The house was more imposing than the pictures had suggested, with towering gables and windows that seemed to stare down at us like watchful eyes. Mrs. Whitmore met us at the door, her demeanor slightly less warm in person. She quickly showed us around, her voice echoing oddly in the high-ceilinged hallways. She pointed out a room at the end of the second-floor hallway and sternly told us it was her private area and completely off-limits. The first night passed uneventfully, but on the second night, things got weird. We were watching a movie in our room when we heard what sounded like footsteps above us. Slow, deliberate steps that would start and stop abruptly. Remembering Mrs. Whitmore's room was directly beneath the attic, we brushed it off as her moving around. But the sounds grew louder, more frantic, as if someone were running back and forth. Curious and a bit unnerved, Jamie and I decided to check the attic. We found the door slightly ajar, which struck us as odd considering Mrs. Whitmore's strict rules. Pushing it open, we were hit by a wave of cold air. The attic was empty except for a single chair facing a small window that overlooked the sea. The creepiest part was a collection of old maritime paintings on the walls, their eyes seeming to follow us as we moved. As we turned to leave, the door slammed shut behind us. We struggled with the handle, but it wouldn't budge. The footsteps started again, this time directly above us in what should have been the empty roof. After what felt like hours, but were only minutes, the door suddenly swung open. Mrs. Whitmore stood there, pale and quiet, insisting it must have been the wind. Unable to sleep, we packed up and left at first light. Once home, Jamie decided to look into the history of the house. It turned out that the Victorian home was once owned by a sea captain who was rumored to have gone mad, locking himself in the attic, watching the sea and waiting for his lost ship that never returned. Mrs. Whitmore never mentioned any of this, and the reviews on her Airbnb's page never hinted at anything amiss. But both Jamie and I know what we heard and felt that night. We learned a valuable lesson. Sometimes, the history of a place stays alive, no matter how much time passes. We haven't gone back to that town since, and I doubt we ever will. I've always been drawn to the unusual, which is probably why I chose the old farmhouse on Airfield Road for my weekend retreat. The listing mentioned that the house was built in the early 1900s and recently restored, offering both rustic charm and modern comforts. It seemed like the perfect place to unwind and perhaps find some inspiration for my writing. When I arrived, the house was more isolated than I had anticipated, set back from the road and surrounded by sprawling fields that had long been left to grow wild. The host, a friendly middle-aged man named Tom, met me at the door. He gave me a quick tour, pointing out the fully stocked kitchen and the cozy reading nook by the fireplace. But he hurried past one door on the ground floor, mumbling that it was just a storage closet. That night, after a day of walking in the fields and enjoying the solitude, I was awakened by a sound that seemed to come from behind the storage closet door. It was a soft, scratching sound, like something trying to burrow its way through wood. Curiosity overcame my sleepiness, and I left my bed to investigate. The door wasn't locked, and when I opened it, I found not a closet but a narrow staircase spiraling downward into darkness. I hesitated, but my curiosity pushed me forward. I descended the stairs, my phone's flashlight cutting through the blackness. At the bottom, I discovered a small, dust-covered room that looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. There was an old wooden desk, a bookshelf filled with tattered books, and a large mirror that seemed oddly out of place in such a room. As I approached the mirror, I noticed something unsettling. My reflection wasn't alone. Standing slightly behind my left shoulder was the figure of a woman, pale and blurred. her eyes seeming to stare right into mine. I spun around, but there was no one there. When I looked back at the mirror, the figure was gone. My heart was racing, and I hurried back up the stairs, closing the door firmly behind me. The next morning, I asked Tom about the room. He frowned, saying that the previous owner had been an eccentric old woman who dabbled in spiritualism and that the room was her sanctuary. He admitted he should have mentioned it, but didn't want to scare me away. He assured me that many guests claimed to feel a presence, but it was harmless. Despite Tom's reassurances, I left the farmhouse feeling unsettled. I couldn't shake the image of the woman in the mirror, and I wondered about the secrets that old room might hold. It was an experience that stayed with me long after I returned to the bustle of the city, a reminder that some places keep their past very much alive. The old Lakeview cabin had stood untouched for nearly 50 years before it was listed on Airbnb. As a horror novelist, the allure of such a place, known for its solitude and eerie past, was irresistible. I booked it for a week, aiming to find inspiration among its whispered legends. The drive up to Lakeview was through winding mountain roads, with thick fog rolling in by the late afternoon, veiling the world in a ghostly gray. When the cabin finally came into view, its wooden facade was enveloped in a mantle of ivy, the windows staring out like dark, unblinking eyes. The key was left under the mat by the host, who only communicated through messages and never met me in person. The inside of the cabin was rustic, with creaking wooden floors and a stone fireplace that seemed to murmur with the echoes of long-forgotten conversations. I spent the days exploring the dense woods and the nights by the fire, writing feverishly. However, each night, I was disturbed by the sound of footsteps on the porch, pacing back and forth, though every time I checked, I found nothing but the whispering wind. On the third night, the footsteps stopped abruptly, replaced by a soft, melodic humming coming from the attic. The melody was hauntingly familiar, yet I couldn't place where I had heard it before. Drawn by a mix of fear and intrigue, I found the narrow attic stairs hidden behind a movable bookshelf. With a flashlight in hand, I ascended. The attic was cluttered with old furniture and boxes of photographs and journals. The humming had ceased by the time I reached the top, replaced by a stifling silence. As I sifted through the boxes, I found a journal belonging to the original owner, a woman named Eliza who had disappeared mysteriously in the 1960s. Her entries were mundane at first, but as I flipped through the pages, they grew more frantic, filled with tales of seeing figures in the woods and hearing voices that called her name from the lake. A chill ran down my spine when I found a photograph of Eliza. It was worn and faded, but she bore an uncanny resemblance to me. The final entry in her journal was simply a date and a scribbled note. Tonight, they say I'll learn the secrets of the lake. Hearing a sudden splash from outside, I rushed to the window overlooking the mist-covered lake. The water was rippling as if something, or someone, had just entered or emerged. The humming resumed behind me, louder now, almost urging me out towards the lake. I packed my things before dawn, the melody still echoing in my mind as I drove away from Lakeview. The host sent a message later, apologizing if the cabin had been unsettling, but offering no explanation. I didn't reply. The experience at Lakeview became the basis for my next novel, though I omitted the true origin of the inspiration. Some stories, I decided, are too real, too chilling to share in full. The echoes of Lakeview, both the humming and the splash, linger with me still, a haunting melody that I can never quite forget.